My parents' faces went pale at their own pool party, not when the food ran low, not when the neighbors started whispering, but when my 11-year-old daughter asked one quiet question that cut cleaner than any accusation ever could. The backyard looked like a magazine spread blue water flashing under string lights, stone pavers still too new to scuff, my sister's kids splashing like they'd invented joy itself. Everyone was laughing. My mom stood by the grill with that proud, curated smile she saves for an audience. My dad had the posture of a man who believed he'd made a smart investment. And in a way, he had. He had invested in this pool. With my daughter's cello, 6 weeks earlier, Lucy's antique cello, the one my grandmother had given her, the one worth $87,000, the one that had lived in a climate-controlled music room like something sacred, disappeared. When I asked where it was, my father didn't hesitate. We sold it, like it was an old couch. Like it didn't belong to an 11-year-old who practiced until her fingers ached. Like it wasn't meant for her future. They told me it was a family asset. They told me Lucy could rent a student instrument. They told me not to upset my grandmother because she was settling into assisted living and didn't need stress. What they really meant was, don't tell her before we finish pouring the concrete. Lucy didn't scream when she found out. She didn't cry. She just went quiet. Quieter than she already knew, how to be in a house where her cousins were allowed to take up space, and she was expected to fold smaller. And now she was standing beside me at the edge of the water, staring at the pool that had cost her something she didn't even have the words to name. Then the gate clicked open. My grandmother walked in, calm, upright, composed, not fragile, not confused, and definitely not uninformed. Beside her was her lawyer, holding a slim folder like it weighed nothing at all. That's when my parents went pale. Because the cello they sold? It was never theirs to sell. And what happened next didn't involve shouting. It involved consequences. Stay with me, because this wasn't just about a stolen instrument. It was about what happens when someone finally decides a child in this family will not come second ever again. My name is Emily Carter. I'm a freelance graphic designer, which means I work from home, drink too much coffee, and spend most of my days fixing problems that other people didn't plan for. But nothing in my career prepared me for the day I had to fix what my own parents did to my daughter. I'm telling you this because sometimes the worst betrayal doesn't come from strangers. It comes from the people who insist they're just trying to help. And sometimes justice doesn't look loud or dramatic. Sometimes it walks through a backyard gate in sensible shoes and ends a party without raising its voice. 6 weeks ago, my parents sold my 11-year-old daughter's antique cello for $87,000. And they used the money to build a pool. If that sounds unbelievable, I promise you it felt worse living through it. The day everything unraveled was bright and hot, the kind of afternoon that makes chlorine sparkle like diamonds. My parents had invited the whole family and half the neighborhood to what they called a pool reveal. There were string lights hanging from a new pergola, catered trays sweating under the sun, music playing just a little too loud as if volume could drown out conscience. My sister Rachel was already in host mode, laughing sharply, drink in hand. Her kids, Ben and Olivia, were cannonballing into the water like they'd personally discovered joy. My mom stood near the grill wearing that satisfied smile she saves for when she believes she's orchestrated something impressive. My dad hovered nearby, chest slightly puffed, like a man who had made a wise investment. And in their minds, they had. They had invested in this pool. With Lucy's cello. Lucy stood next to me in her swimsuit under her sundress, clutching her towel like it was armor. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't sulking either. She was studying the water. Quiet. Calculating in a way no 11-year-old should have to calculate. She knew. She knew what this cost. 6 weeks earlier, we had walked into my parents' house expecting an ordinary afternoon practice session. Lucy had been humming in the car, tapping rhythms against her knees, already halfway inside the music she planned to play. The cello lived at my parents' house in what used to be my grandmother's music room, a temperature-controlled sanctuary lined with old sheet music and the faint scent of polish and peppermint tea. That cello wasn't just wood and varnish. It had belonged to my grandmother. She had it appraised, documented, insured. She told Lucy stories about its age, about the hands that had played it before her. And when Lucy played, something in her posture changed. She wasn't the quiet cousin anymore. She was certain, precise, alive. That afternoon, the humidifier was humming. The stand was there. The corner, where the case always rested, was empty. Lucy didn't scream. She didn't cry. She froze. Then she asked the smallest, most careful question. Did great-grandma change her mind? I went to the kitchen. My father looked up from his tablet when I asked where the cello was. He didn't hesitate. We sold it. Just like that. My mom took a sip of coffee as if we were discussing the weather. It was valuable, my dad explained calmly. It was sitting there. Your grandmother wasn't using it. It wasn't yours, I said. It was a family asset, he replied. Rachel rolled her eyes. She's 11. She can use a student one. And then came the sentence that told me they knew exactly what they were doing. Don't tell your grandmother. Because my grandmother had just moved into assisted living. Because she didn't need stress. Because peace in our family has always meant silence from the person most inconvenienced. Lucy practiced that night on a borrowed student cello from her teacher. It sounded thin, hollow, like a cardboard box trying its best to be something it wasn't. She adjusted her posture, tried again, blinked hard. I can still practice, she told me carefully. It's just harder. That was the part that broke me. Not anger, not tantrums, adaptation. Lucy has always known how to shrink in my parents' house. Rachel's kids are spirited. Lucy is so well behaved. If she laughs too loudly, it's inside voice, sweetheart. If her cousins scream, it's aren't they adorable? In my family, Lucy learned to take up less space. But the cello was the one place she didn't have to. And now it was gone. Back at the pool party, as I watched sunlight shimmer across $87,000 worth of water, I realized something else. They weren't sorry, they were proud. My dad clapped his hands to get everyone's attention. My mom raised her glass. Rachel beamed like a queen presenting her kingdom. Lucy shifted closer to me. And then, just as someone asked casually, "Is Margaret coming today?" The gate clicked open. My grandmother walked in. Not fragile, not confused, not unaware. She wore a crisp blouse, her spine straight, her expression calm. Beside her stood Andrew, her attorney and longtime friend, holding a slim folder. The laughter didn't stop all at once. It just faltered. My mother's smile flickered. My father's posture stiffened. Rachel's hand froze mid-gesture. Lucy straightened slightly, as if her body recognized safety before her mind did. My grandmother surveyed the pool slowly, taking in the stone, the water, the spectacle. Then she looked at my parents, and she smiled. Not warmly, not angrily, just knowingly. Because the cello they sold, it was never theirs to sell. And in that moment, while neighbors held paper plates and my sister's kids splashed obliviously in stolen luxury, I understood something my parents didn't. This wasn't going to be a shouting match. This was going to be a reckoning. And if you think this story is just about an instrument or a pool, stay with me. Because what happened next didn't just return a cello. It changed who gets to take up space in my family forever. You can smell renovation the way you can smell a lie. It hits the back of your throat before your brain has caught up. Fresh paint, sawdust, that sharp chemical tang that says someone has spent money they didn't tell you about. I noticed it the second I unlocked my parents' front door that afternoon. Lucy climbed out of the car beside me, backpack slung over one shoulder, her music binder tucked carefully against her chest. She'd left the important part, the cello, inside the house, where it always stayed in my grandmother's old music room. The room had its own humidifier, its own quiet. My apartment was too small for something that valuable, too drafty, too close to neighbors who didn't appreciate long practice sessions. So, the cello lived there. Safe, protected. At least, that's what I believed when we pulled into the driveway. Lucy was humming under her breath as we walked up the path, tapping rhythms against her thigh like she was already rehearsing in her head. She'd been looking forward to practicing all day. Not in the, chores way kids sometimes do activities, but in that focused, private way she disappears when she plays. The world shrinks to sound and bow pressure and the angle of her wrist. "Do you think great-grandma will be there?" she asked, tightening her ponytail like she could control the universe with elastic. She's at her place today, I said. We'll call her later. Lucy nodded. But hope has a way of lingering in kids. She still glanced toward the windows, as if my grandmother might appear behind the curtains, waiting with peppermint tea and sheet music corrections. The second the door opened, that smell rolled over us. And then I heard it. Power tools, muffled but steady. A high whine cutting through the house like a mosquito that won't die. Lucy's face lit up. Are they fixing something? I didn't answer right away because my brain was buffering. Reality wasn't matching the script in my head. The hallway runner was rolled up and covered in plastic. Blue painter's tape marked off sections of the wall. Cardboard boxes lined one side, like the house was mid-surgery. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't minor. It was money. Lucy tiptoed forward like she'd wandered into a museum exhibit. "Mom?" she called, half excited, half confused. No answer. We moved toward the back of the house, and that's when I saw it through the window. The yard was gone. Not trimmed. Not landscaped. Gone. The grass had been peeled back like skin. Dirt piled in uneven mounds. Rebar gridwork cutting through the earth. Wooden forms outlining something too symmetrical to ignore. A rectangle. Deep. Deliberate. A pool. Not inflatable. Not above ground. Not modest. An in-ground pool. Lucy blinked. Is that for us? There was so much hope in her voice it made my stomach twist. I don't know, I said carefully. Let's go get your cello. Because that was the priority. The thing that mattered. The thing that wasn't supposed to move. We walked down the hallway toward the music room. That room had always felt different from the rest of the house. It didn't belong to my mother's carefully curated aesthetic or my father's sense of ownership. It belonged to my grandmother. Even when she lived there, she kept it as a boundary, temperature-controlled, humidifier humming softly, sheet music stacked in neat piles, a cabinet with a lock because she wasn't naive about people. Lucy loved that room. She said it smelled like polish and peppermint tea. I used to joke that it smelled like someone who still believed in rules. I pushed the door open. The humidifier was still running. The stand was still in its place. The corner where the cello case always rested, where Lucy's cello rested like it had roots, was empty. Not shifted. Not leaning somewhere else. Empty. Lucy didn't react right away. She stepped inside slowly, like she'd walked into the wrong house. Her eyes moved from the stand to the shelf, to the floor, like maybe it had fallen and no one had noticed. She crouched slightly and peeked behind the chair. Then she looked at me. Did Great-Grandma change her mind? She asked softly. There are moments as a parent when you feel something inside you tilt permanently. That was one of them. No, I said. Lucy swallowed. Then where is it? She didn't sound angry. That would have been easier. She sounded careful, like the question itself might cause trouble. Her hand drifted to the space where the case should have been, hovering in the air as if expecting to feel wood beneath her fingers. When she touched nothing, she pulled back quickly, like she'd brushed against a hot stove. Her eyes glossed over, but she didn't cry. She just nodded once, too hard, forcing the moment to behave. I felt the truth forming before I had proof. The renovation, the excavation, the smell of money. I left Lucy standing in that room because I needed her not to see my face when I found out. The kitchen was loud in a different way. Not construction noise, just comfort. My mother stood at the counter with a mug in her hand, phone in the other, hair pulled back like she'd been busy. My father sat at the table scrolling on his tablet. Rachel perched on a stool, sipping something green and expensive-looking. No one looked startled to see me. "Where's Lucy's cello?" I asked. My mother blinked slowly, like the question itself was inconvenient. "Good afternoon to you too, Emily." "Where is it?" I repeated. My father finally looked up. Calm, steady. "We sold it." The words didn't echo. They just landed. Rachel sighed dramatically. "Oh my God. You sold it?" I said, because sometimes repetition is the only way to confirm reality. "It was valuable," my dad said, as if explaining an obvious financial decision. "Your grandmother wasn't using it." "It wasn't yours," I said. "It was in our house," he replied. Rachel added, "She's 11. She doesn't need something like that. She can use a student instrument. $2. My mother set her mug down gently. And before you get dramatic, you are not telling your grandmother. She doesn't need stress. Not telling her. Because somewhere inside, they knew this wasn't clean. I stood there, the smell of fresh paint still clinging to the air, and realized something I hadn't wanted to admit. This wasn't an accident. It was a calculation. They had waited until my grandmother moved out. Waited until the room was theirs to access. Waited until the paperwork was out of sight. Then, they took what they wanted and poured it into concrete. I walked back down the hallway slowly. Lucy was still in the music room, standing near the empty corner like she was waiting for the cello to reappear if she stayed patient enough. When she saw my face, she didn't ask again. She just nodded. That quiet acceptance told me more about my family than any argument ever could. And as we left the house, stepping back into the smell of dirt and construction and ambition, I understood something that made my chest feel tight. This wasn't just about a pool. It was about who, in this family, was allowed to matter. Lucy didn't cry on the drive home. That was the part that unsettled me the most. She sat in the passenger seat, hands folded neatly in her lap, staring out the window as neighborhoods blurred past. No dramatic questions, no anger, just silence. The kind of silence that forms when a child is trying to solve something too heavy for her age. When we got back to our apartment, she went straight to her room and pulled out the battered student cello her teacher kept for emergencies. It had scratches along the sides and a faint buzz in the lower strings. It wasn't terrible, it just wasn't hers. I leaned against the doorway and watched her adjust the end pin, tighten the bow, settle into position like nothing had happened. The first note came out thin, hollow, like the instrument was apologizing for itself. Lucy didn't complain. She adjusted her grip the way my grandmother had taught her, 2 fingers correcting pressure, slight tilt of the wrist. She tried again. The sound improved, but it didn't bloom the way it used to. She blinked hard. "I can still practice," she said carefully, not looking at me. "It's just harder." "I know," I said. She nodded like that was enough explanation. Then she added, almost in a whisper, "Maybe great-grandma didn't mean for it to be mine yet." That sentence settled into my chest like a stone. Lucy had spent months in that music room with my grandmother. Hours of scales and small corrections. My grandmother never overpraised. She was precise. "Better," she would say. Or, "Your left hand is talking too loudly." Lucy would giggle and fix it. With her, Lucy wasn't the quiet cousin. She was a musician, and now she was blaming herself. I stood there long after she stopped playing, listening to the faint echo of strings that didn't belong to her. I realized something I didn't like about myself. I had spent most of my life trying not to be difficult in that house. I thought being easy made me loved. What it really did was make me manageable. Lucy had learned that lesson by watching me. In my parents' house, Rachel's kids were celebrated for volume. Ben could run down the hallway screaming, and my dad would laugh. "He's got lungs on him." Olivia could demand attention mid-conversation, and Rachel would scoop her up like royalty. If Lucy laughed too loudly, my mom would smile tightly and say, inside voice, "Sweetheart." 18. If Lucy needed something, it came with a sigh. She learned to shrink in increments. Small adjustments. Less space. Less noise. The music room had been the only place she didn't have to. That room wasn't just temperature-controlled, it was respect-controlled. My grandmother set boundaries there. No sticky fingers, no interruptions, no one entered without permission. The cabinet had a lock for a reason. She had shown me the file once: appraisal documents, photographs, serial numbers, insurance forms. She tapped the page and said, "This is not just sentimental, Emily. It's valuable. People get strange around valuable things." I nodded back then, assuming she meant strangers. I didn't think she meant my parents. My grandmother had moved out less than a week before the cello disappeared. My mother described the assisted living community as perfect and safer and less stressful. Maybe it was. It smelled like lemon cleaner and expensive soap instead of passive aggression. But once she left the house, something shifted. The last pair of eyes that held authority, real authority, was gone. And my parents did what they always do when oversight disappears. They took. Lucy finished practicing and set the bow down gently. She didn't slam it, she didn't throw it aside. She just placed it carefully on the stand. That carefulness broke me more than tears would have. "Do you want to call Great-Grandma?" I asked. Lucy hesitated. Mom said not to upset her. There it was. My mother's voice, already embedded. I felt something go very still inside me. That night, after Lucy went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with my phone in front of me. The room was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator. I scrolled through social media and saw Rachel's newest post. A photo of the backyard excavation. Caption: "Big things happening. Worth every penny." Ivnow Stubbins. Worth every penny. I took screenshots. Not because I knew what I would do with them yet, but because something in me had stopped trusting coincidence. I kept thinking about the timeline. My grandmother moves out, construction starts, cello disappears, pool grows. It wasn't subtle. It was a sequence. I thought about my father's voice. It was a family asset. I thought about my mother's warning. "Do not tell your grandmother." 80. And I thought about Lucy standing in that empty corner, asking if she'd done something wrong. That question changed everything. I had spent years swallowing discomfort for the sake of keeping peace. But peace that requires silence from the injured party isn't peace, it's convenience. I wasn't going to teach Lucy that silence was the cost of belonging. The next morning, I drove to my grandmother's new place. The building was bright and tidy, sunlight pooling across polished floors. Residents chatted softly in a lounge that felt controlled, not depressing. There's a difference. Controlled means chosen. Depressing means resigned. At the front desk, a woman smiled warmly. "Who are you visiting?" "Margaret," I said. "Oh," she replied with a knowing smile. "She's in the lounge. She's been expecting you." Of course she had. My grandmother was sitting in an armchair with a book open in her lap, glasses low on her nose. She looked up the second I entered. "Sit," she said calmly. "Your face is doing that thing." I sat. I didn't dramatize. I didn't rant. I told her what happened plainly. The empty corner, the kitchen conversation, the pool, the price. When I finished, she closed her book carefully. "And Lucy?" she asked. "She thinks she did something wrong." My grandmother's jaw tightened just slightly. "She thought it was her fault?" she repeated softly. I nodded. My grandmother didn't cry. She didn't gasp. She leaned forward, resting her hands lightly on her knees. "When did you last see the file?" she asked. "What file?" "The documentation," she replied evenly. "The appraisal. The identifiers." "I saw it months ago. You showed me." She nodded once. "Good." Then she asked for screenshots of Rachel's posts. Dates. Anything showing when construction began. I blinked. "Grandma, are you okay?" She looked at me over the rim of her glasses. "I am not the one who should be worried," she said. And in that moment, I understood something I should have remembered sooner. My grandmother was not fragile. She was strategic. And for the first time since Lucy stood in that empty corner, I felt the faintest shift in the air, like pressure changing before a storm. The cello might have been gone, but the story wasn't over. When my grandmother says she will handle something, she doesn't mean she's going to argue about it over coffee. She means she's already 3 steps ahead. After I told her everything, the empty corner, the pool excavation, my parents' calm explanation, Lucy blaming herself, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse. She didn't even sigh dramatically. She just asked questions. Precise questions. "When exactly did I move out?" "3 Mondays ago," I said. "And when did the construction begin?" "The same week." She nodded once, filing it away. "And the buyer? Did your father say who purchased it?" "A collector, paid by wire, quick sale." Her lips pressed together very slightly. Not anger. Calculation. "Good," she said. "Good?" I repeated, confused. "Yes, quick sales leave trails." She stood, smoothing the front of her blouse, and walked toward the small desk by her window. She picked up her phone and dialed a number from memory. She didn't put it on speaker. I could only hear her side of the conversation. Andrew, it's Margaret. I need you to check something for me. Yes, the instrument. I believe it was sold without authorization. I have the documentation. Of course I do. There was a pause. No, I'm not upset, she said calmly. I'm interested. She hung up and turned to me. Emily, she said gently. I created a trust for Lucy 2 years ago. I blinked. You what? The cello was placed into a trust, she explained evenly. I am the trustee. Lucy is the beneficiary. That instrument was legally hers. No one else had the authority to sell it. I felt the air leave my lungs slowly. They didn't know, I said. I did not inform them, she replied. I have been alive long enough to know that clarity is not always protection. Paperwork is. I stared at her, a strange mix of relief and dread rising in my chest. So what happens now? She gave me a look that almost resembled amusement. Now, she said, we wait. Waiting turned out to be the hardest part. Days passed, then a week, then two. Lucy continued practicing on the rental instrument her teacher had helped us secure at a discount. It was better than the emergency student cello, but it still lacked something. The sound didn't open the same way. Lucy adjusted, because Lucy always adjusts. She got quieter. Not visibly broken. Just dimmed around the edges. At night, I watched her run scales with careful precision, like if she practiced hard enough, she could compensate for what was taken. She never mentioned the pool. She never asked if we were going back to my parents' house. She just practiced. Meanwhile, my parents' backyard transformed at record speed. Rachel posted constant updates. Fresh concrete, stone installation, a shipment of patio furniture, captions like, making memories, and, so grateful for family. I screenshot everything. I didn't respond to the group chat. I didn't argue. Silence unsettles people more than confrontation sometimes. My mother called once, her tone clipped. I assume you're not telling anyone about the cello. I haven't said anything, I replied truthfully. Good, she said. No need to create drama. Drama. As if my daughter's inheritance had been a decorative pillow they'd misplaced. 3 weeks after my visit to my grandmother, she called me early one morning. It's been located, she said. I sat up straight. Where? With a private collector in another state. Andrew made contact. The transaction was documented. Wire transfer confirmed. And, she continued calmly, he was very interested to learn the instrument was not legally available for sale. I swallowed. Is he angry? Collectors tend to dislike complications, she replied. Particularly legal ones. I almost felt bad for a second. Almost. What happens next? I asked. The buyer has been informed that the sale was unauthorized, she said. The funds will need to be returned. In full. And the cello? It will be recovered. Her voice remained even, but there was steel underneath it. And your parents? I asked quietly. She paused. Consequences tend to arrive on their own, she said. But I believe clarity is best delivered publicly. Just Hose. That word lingered. Publicly. A week later, an invitation appeared in the family group chat. BBQ this Saturday, 2 p.m. Pool reveal. Bring a side. No apology. No acknowledgement. Just logistics. Lucy glanced over my shoulder at the message. Are we going? She asked. I hesitated. Before I could answer, my phone rang. It was my grandmother. We're going, she said. Grandma, I do not want Lucy watching you swallow this, she said gently. She needs to see how boundaries work. It's Stody and Carely. There was no anger in her tone. Just certainty. It's in motion, she added. What is? You'll see. Saturday arrived heavy with heat. Lucy wore her swimsuit under her clothes again. Hope is stubborn in children, even after betrayal. When we pulled up to my parents' house, the street was lined with cars. Laughter spilled over the fence. Music thumped faintly. The backyard was transformed. Blue water shimmered under the sun. New stone deck, lounge chairs arranged like a magazine ad. Ben and Olivia were already in the pool, shrieking with delight. Rachel stood near the pergola, drink in hand, laughing loudly. My mom floated between guests, basking. My dad stood near the grill, proud and relaxed. Lucy stopped walking for a second when she saw it all. I placed my hand on her shoulder. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She just looked. My mom spotted us and pasted on a bright expression. "Emily! Lucy! You made it!" "Well." Rachel raised her eyebrows slightly, surprised but not pleased. My dad gave a short nod. Then, someone near the food table asked casually, "Is Margaret coming?" My mother's smile tightened. "She's busy." The gate clicked open. Everyone turned. My grandmother stepped inside. Not in a wheelchair, not escorted by staff, upright, composed, wearing a crisp blouse and slacks like she was attending a board meeting. Beside her walked Andrew, carrying a slim folder. The shift in the air was immediate. My father's posture stiffened. My mother's color drained. Rachel lowered her glass. Lucy straightened beside me. My grandmother surveyed the pool slowly, her gaze traveling across water, stone, string lights. "Well," she said pleasantly, "you've been busy." My mother forced a laugh. "Mom, this is a party." "I know," my grandmother replied calmly. "That's why I came." She looked at Lucy first. Her expression softened for a fraction of a second. Then she turned to my parents. "I heard you sold the cello." The laughter in the yard died mid-breath, and for the first time since that empty corner in the music room, I felt something shift fully into place. This wasn't going to be loud. It was going to be precise. The backyard didn't explode into chaos. It collapsed quietly. There's a difference. When my grandmother said, "I heard you sold the cello," it wasn't loud. It wasn't emotional. It was controlled. And somehow, that made it worse. My father cleared his throat first. "Let's not do this here," he muttered, glancing around at the neighbors holding paper plates. My grandmother tilted her head slightly. "You've had weeks to do it privately. We have Centranavide." My mother stepped forward, her voice tight but still trying to perform calm. "We didn't want to upset you." "You didn't want consequences," my grandmother corrected. That word landed heavier than accusation. Rachel scoffed. "This is ridiculous." Andrew stepped forward then, quiet and unassuming, the slim folder in his hand suddenly looking significant. My grandmother didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on my parents. "The cello," she said evenly, "was held in trust for Lucy." "Aid in there." Silence. Even the kids in the pool seemed to pause between splashes. "I am the trustee," she continued. "Lucy is the beneficiary. That instrument was not a family asset. It was not yours to sell." My father stared at her like he'd misheard. "What trust?" my mother asked, her voice cracking at the edges. "The legal one," my grandmother replied. Rachel's face flushed. "You never said anything about a trust." "Correct," my grandmother said calmly. "I did not." ADS. I watched my father's confidence unravel in real time. His posture shifted, shoulders pulling inward. "We didn't know," he said. "I'm aware," my grandmother replied. "That is not a defense." Andrew opened the folder and removed a set of documents. The paper didn't flap dramatically in the breeze. It simply existed, solid, official. "The buyer has been notified," Andrew said in a steady tone. "The sale was unauthorized. The funds will need to be returned in full." "Everyone." My mother's lips parted slightly. "Returned?" "In full," Andrew repeated. Rachel's voice rose. "This is insane. We improved the property." My grandmother's gaze flicked toward the pool. "You improved your comfort," she said, "with money that did not belong to you." The crowd had shifted into that awkward half-circle people form when they don't know if they're allowed to leave. Conversation stalled. Someone coughed. A child asked loudly for a popsicle and was quickly hushed. Lucy's hand found mine. I squeezed back. My father's voice grew thin. "Where is it?" "Safe," my grandmother said. Lucy's breath caught beside me. Safe. It was such a small word. But it broke something open in her face. Not a smile. Not yet. Just relief loosening the tight line around her mouth. "It was recovered this morning," my grandmother continued. "It will be returned to Lucy." Rachel shook her head. "So what, she just gets everything now?" "She gets what was hers," I said before I could stop myself. Rachel's eyes snapped toward me. You're enjoying this. I laughed once, sharp and humorless. You built a pool with my daughter's inheritance. It was for the kids, Rachel insisted, gesturing wildly toward Ben and Olivia. My grandmother's expression hardened. Lucy is a child. The simplicity of that sentence made Rachel fall silent. Andrew extended another set of papers. And there's one more matter, he said calmly. My mother stared at the documents like they might bite her. What is that? Notice to vacate, Andrew replied. 60 days. The air shifted again. You're kicking us out? My father asked, disbelief bleeding into panic. My grandmother did not blink. It is the house you live in, she said, not the house you own. My mother's face drained of color completely. Mom, you can't do this. I can, she said. There was no triumph in her tone. No gloating, just fact. Rachel looked around as if someone else might intervene, but no one stepped forward. People avoid gravity when it starts pulling. This is because of Emily, Rachel snapped. She turned you against us. No, my grandmother said firmly. This is because you sold a child's instrument and poured the money into concrete. The truth hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Lucy tugged gently at my hand. I looked down at her. I thought I did something wrong, she whispered. My grandmother heard her. She stepped closer, her expression softening in a way it hadn't for anyone else that afternoon. You did nothing wrong, she said, kneeling slightly so her eyes were level with Lucy's. It was taken. That is not the same thing. Lucy's lip trembled, but she held steady. I could see the shift happening inside her, the recalibration of blame. Behind us, the party was dissolving. Guests began collecting bags and calling children out of the water. The music was turned off. The grill went quiet. My father stood rigid, staring at the pool as if it might explain itself. What are we supposed to do? My mother asked, her voice no longer polished. Return the funds, Andrew replied simply. With what? Rachel demanded. That question didn't receive an answer, because it wasn't my grandmother's job to solve the mess they created. The pool shimmered under the sun, still beautiful, still expensive. But something about it had shifted. It no longer looked like success. It looked like evidence. Lucy leaned slightly into me. I get it back? She asked softly. Yes, my grandmother said. Tomorrow. Lucy exhaled slowly, as if she'd been holding that breath for 6 weeks. I realized then that this wasn't revenge. It wasn't even about punishment. It was about restoration. About teaching Lucy that when someone crosses a boundary, the answer isn't to shrink smaller. It's to stand still and let the truth stand with you. My parents didn't argue much after that. Not publicly. Pride is quieter when it's cornered. Rachel hissed something to my father, but he didn't respond. He looked older suddenly, smaller. As we turned to leave, my grandmother placed a steady hand on my shoulder. I should have anticipated this, she said quietly. You trusted them, I replied. She shook her head faintly. I prepared for them. And that was the difference. The next day, the cello arrived in its hard case, slightly scuffed from travel. Lucy opened it slowly, almost reverently. Her fingers traced the curve of the wood, as if checking for damage, for reassurance. When she drew the bow across the strings for the first time again, the sound filled the room in a way the rental never could. Full, alive, certain. I watched her posture change immediately, shoulders back, chin lifted. That sound wasn't just music. It was proof. Proof that what was taken could be returned. Proof that silence wasn't the only option. Proof that in this family, Lucy would no longer be second tier. And as for my parents, they had 60 days. Concrete is expensive, but consequences cost more. After the party dissolved and the neighbors carried their awkward silence back to their cars, I expected to feel triumphant. I didn't. I felt steady. There's a difference. Triumph is loud and fleeting. Steady is quiet and permanent. And what my grandmother had done wasn't dramatic, it was corrective. She hadn't humiliated them. She hadn't screamed. She had simply removed the illusion that they could take without consequence. The cello came home the next afternoon. It arrived in a hard black case that looked like it had traveled through more hands than it ever should have. Lucy stood beside me as we brought it inside. She didn't rush, she didn't tear it open like a birthday gift. She knelt carefully and unlatched each clasp one by one, like she was reopening something sacred. When the lid lifted, the familiar scent of polished wood drifted up, warm and faintly sweet. Lucy ran her fingers lightly across the varnished curve, checking for damage the way you might check a loved one for bruises. "It's okay," she whispered. Not to me, to the cello. My grandmother stood nearby, watching quietly. When Lucy wrapped her arms around her in a sudden, fierce hug, I saw my grandmother close her eyes for just a moment. That was the only crack in her composure. Relief finally allowed. Lucy tuned the strings with careful precision. When she drew the bow across them, the sound that filled our living room was full-bodied and resonant, alive in a way the rental instrument had never been. It didn't struggle, it didn't apologize. Lucy didn't either. Her shoulders squared, her chin lifted slightly. That small shift in posture told me more than any speech could have. Meanwhile, reality began settling in on the other side of town. The buyer who had wired $87,000 was not interested in my parents' confusion. He wanted his money returned. In full. Quickly. The phrase repayment plan entered my parents' vocabulary like an illness. I heard about it through clipped phone calls and tense voicemails my mother left, pretending she still controlled the narrative. "We didn't know," she repeated. Ignorance is expensive when paperwork exists. 60 days moves faster than people expect. Especially when they believed the house they lived in belonged to them. My grandmother did not waver. There were no late-night reconciliations. No secret apologies accepted behind closed doors. She kept everything above board. Through Andrew, through documentation, through legal channels. Calm, thorough, unemotional. Rachel tried rage first. "This is overkill," she told me in a sharp call one evening. "It was a misunderstanding." "You poured the money into concrete," I replied. "It was for the kids." Lucy is a kid. That line never stopped landing. Then Rachel tried distance. "I told them it was risky," she claimed later. "I didn't think they'd actually go through with it." Families like mine have a talent for rewriting history the moment consequences appear. What was, "we all agreed," becomes, "I warned them." Accountability becomes optional if the story is edited fast enough. Ben and Olivia adjusted the way children always do. They didn't understand mortgages or trusts or unauthorized sales. They just knew their parents were stressed and boxes were appearing in corners. Lucy adjusted too, but differently. She began speaking up. Small things at first. "Actually, I was sitting there. I don't like that joke." "No, I'm not okay with that." The first time she corrected my mother politely but firmly, I felt something inside me unclench. My mother's mouth tightened like she'd tasted something bitter, but she didn't push back, because the illusion had been broken. My grandmother made another quiet decision during that period. One evening, she came over with a folder different from the one Andrew had carried at the party, but just as deliberate. "I've updated the trust," she said, setting it on my kitchen table. I sat down slowly. "Updated how?" "The house," she replied calmly. "It's being placed into a separate trust. I will remain trustee for now. You will be the beneficiary." I blinked. "Grandma, it will not be sold out from under you," she said. "And Lucy will never have to wonder if she belongs in it." The simplicity of that statement undid me more than anything else had. Belonging. That was the real theft. Not just the cello. Not just the money. The message that Lucy's place was conditional. We packed our apartment slowly over the next few weeks. No rush, no spectacle. Just boxes labeled in my handwriting, and Lucy carefully wrapping sheet music in protective sleeves. When the 60-day mark arrived, my parents moved out of the house they had treated as permanent. I watched from a distance, not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. This wasn't my battle to narrate for them anymore. My mother attempted one last conversation. "You're tearing this family apart," she said quietly, standing on the front walkway, surrounded by half-packed boxes. "I didn't sell a child's inheritance," I replied. She looked tired then, smaller. "This didn't have to be public," she muttered. "It didn't," I agreed. "It just had to be honest." She didn't respond. When the last car pulled away and the driveway emptied, the house felt different. Not victorious. Light. That first night, Lucy and I slept there without construction noise, without the hum of resentment. The air felt still in a way that wasn't tense, just quiet. Earned quiet. A week later, my grandmother moved back in, not as someone being managed, not as a temporary inconvenience, but as the person who had always anchored that space. Lucy helped her unpack sweaters and books, carried the tin of peppermint tea back to the kitchen like it was a ceremonial object. The music room reopened fully. The humidifier hummed. The cabinet lock clicked into place, not out of paranoia, but habit. And when Lucy practiced, the sound traveled through the house without interruption. No one told her to use her inside voice. No one sighed at the repetition of scales. Just music filling rooms that no longer felt conditional. Spring came, and Lucy auditioned for the Regional Youth Orchestra. She walked into that audition holding the same cello that had been sold and recovered, her posture steady. When she got the acceptance letter, she didn't scream. She smiled. Certain. Later that evening, as she practiced in the living room, I sat beside my grandmother on the couch. "You didn't go too far," I said quietly. My grandmother looked at Lucy, then back at me. "I went far enough," she replied. And I understood. Justice isn't always loud. It doesn't need to humiliate to be effective. Sometimes it simply restores what was taken and redraws the lines no one respected. The pool still exists. Concrete doesn't disappear just because truth shows up. But when I think about that backyard now, I don't see stolen money shimmering in the sun. I see the moment Lucy learned she doesn't have to shrink to belong. And that lesson will last longer than any pool ever could. People like to imagine that once justice is served, everything feels clean. It doesn't. It feels rearranged. After my parents moved out and Lucy and I settled into the house, the silence was almost unfamiliar. No construction noise, no forced laughter from the backyard, no underlying tension humming through the walls, just the steady rhythm of a house breathing the way it was meant to. But silence gives you space to think. And thinking brings reflection. I kept replaying the months leading up to all of it, the subtle shifts I ignored, the comments I dismissed, the way my mother framed my grandmother's move as for everyone's benefit. At the time, I had believed it. Or maybe I had just wanted to believe it. My grandmother had lived in that house for years, long before Rachel and her husband moved back in, temporarily. Temporary has a way of growing roots in my family. What starts as a favor becomes an entitlement. What begins as shared space becomes assumed ownership. I remember the first time my mother mentioned assisted living. She said it gently, as if offering a spa retreat. "Mom would have more support," she explained. "Less stress. We all need balance." Balance. It sounded reasonable, thoughtful, responsible. But looking back, I can see the subtle relief in her tone, the unspoken convenience. My grandmother didn't fight the move. That's what makes people underestimate her. She rarely fights loudly. She observes, she calculates, she prepares. The day she packed her things, she did it methodically. Sweaters folded, books boxed, paperwork organized. She handed me a small envelope before she left. "Just in case," she said. Inside were copies of the cello's appraisal and trust documents. I didn't think much of it at the time. I assumed it was just her way of being thorough. Now I understand it was foresight. Once she moved out, the house changed almost immediately. The atmosphere lightened for Rachel and my parents. Not in a warm way, in a reckless way. There was less restraint, fewer quiet glances exchanged before decisions were made. It was like the final set of adult eyes had left the room. Lucy noticed the shift too, though she didn't articulate it. Before, when she practiced in the music room, my grandmother would sit nearby, correcting posture with 2 fingers and a raised brow. After the move, Lucy practiced alone there for a few days before the cello disappeared. She told me once that it felt different. "Different how?" I'd asked. "Like the room was waiting," she said. Waiting. That word stayed with me. Because once my grandmother was gone, that room became less sanctuary and more storage in my parents' minds. Something valuable, sitting unused. Something convertible. My father has always been practical to a fault. He sees objects in terms of potential return. If something can be monetized, it's wasted if it isn't. My mother frames decisions as collective benefit. Rachel frames them as deserved upgrades. Together, they create momentum. And momentum without boundaries is dangerous. After the cello was recovered and the eviction notices delivered, my mother tried to soften history. She invited me for coffee at a neutral cafe, away from the house. "We made a mistake," she said, stirring her drink too quickly. "We thought Lucy wouldn't even know the difference." That sentence revealed more than she intended. "You thought she wouldn't matter," I said quietly. "That's not fair," she replied quickly. "We were thinking about everyone. Everyone except her." She looked tired then, less defensive, more bewildered. "I didn't think Mom would react like that," she admitted. I almost smiled. "You didn't think she'd prepared?" Preparation is the quietest form of power. The buyer's pressure increased over those weeks. I overheard fragments of phone calls when Lucy and I stopped by briefly to pick up a few remaining items. "Installments won't work," my father muttered once, pacing. "He wants it returned immediately." Concrete is hard to liquidate. Rachel and her husband eventually distanced themselves from the financial fallout. What began as "our backyard" became their decision. Responsibility narrowed conveniently. Ben and Olivia adjusted faster than anyone. They visited occasionally, splashing in the pool as if nothing had changed. Children are remarkably resilient when adults shield them from details. Lucy wasn't shielded. She witnessed accountability, and it changed her. She began asking questions she never used to ask. "Why didn't they just ask Great-Grandma? Why didn't they tell me?" "They thought you wouldn't understand," I answered honestly. She considered that quietly. "I understand now," she said. There was no bitterness in her tone, just clarity. That clarity shifted something in our relationship too. Lucy started speaking more openly about things that bothered her at school, about jokes she didn't find funny, about moments she felt overlooked. She wasn't louder. She was steadier. The house reflected that shift. My grandmother returned not as a guest but as an anchor. She reclaimed the music room fully, adjusting the humidifier, reorganizing sheet music, locking the cabinet with deliberate clicks. "Boundaries," she said once when I watched her secure it, "are not about mistrust. They're about clarity." Clarity. That word threaded through everything. One evening, as Lucy practiced a particularly demanding piece, the sound filled the hallway and spilled into the kitchen. It wasn't perfect yet. There were sharp edges and hesitant transitions. But it was confident. My grandmother sat in the living room with her eyes closed, listening. "She has it," she murmured. "She always did," I replied. "No," she corrected gently. "She always believed she might." Belief is fragile in environments where you're asked to shrink. The final day my parents officially vacated the house was anticlimactic. No shouting, no dramatic exits. Just boxes loaded into a moving truck under a sky that didn't care either way. My mother paused at the front door before leaving. "I hope you're happy," she said. It wasn't cruel. It was confused. "I hope Lucy is," I answered. She nodded slowly and walked away. When the door closed, the sound echoed differently. Not like an ending, more like a reset. That night, Lucy practiced late. The notes climbed steadily, fuller than before, reverberating through rooms that no longer felt contested. I realized then that the cello had never just been an instrument. It was a test. Of character, of boundaries, of who would stand up when it mattered. My grandmother had anticipated risk. She had prepared for it. She had refused to let convenience override principle. And Lucy had learned something no 11-year-old should have to learn, but now carried like armor. That her place is not conditional. The house is quieter now. Not empty. Not tense. Just quiet in a way that feels chosen. And every time Lucy draws her bow across those strings, I'm reminded that some things can be taken temporarily, but if the right person prepared, they can be restored. Stronger than before. For a while, after everything settled, people kept asking me the same question in different ways. Was it worth it? They never meant the cello. They meant the fallout. The strained holidays. The quieter group chats. The way my mother's voice now carries a careful edge when she speaks to me, like she's testing each word before it leaves her mouth. And every time, I think about Lucy, standing in that music room weeks earlier, staring at an empty corner and asking if she had done something wrong. Yes, it was worth it. But that clarity didn't arrive overnight. It unfolded slowly, in the quiet days after the spectacle of the pool party faded and reality took over. My parents moved into a smaller rental across town. No backyard, no string lights, no shimmering water reflecting pride, just beige siding and a narrow driveway. I didn't visit immediately, not out of cruelty, out of necessity. Space was part of the boundary. Rachel adjusted her tone almost instantly. She shifted from defiant to diplomatic, texting me photos of Ben's school projects and Olivia's dance recital like nothing catastrophic had occurred. The human mind has an incredible capacity to compartmentalize when guilt is inconvenient. But underneath the polite messages, something fundamental had changed. The hierarchy in our family was no longer assumed. Lucy noticed it too. The next time we saw my parents at a carefully neutral Sunday lunch, Lucy walked in with her cello case, slung confidently over her shoulder. She wasn't showing off. She was simply not hiding. My mother glanced at the case and then at me. A flicker of something crossed her face. Regret, maybe. Or recognition. Are you practicing something new? She asked Lucy, her tone gentler than usual. Yes, Lucy replied evenly. I have auditions coming up. She didn't say thank you for asking. She didn't apologize for bringing it. She just stated a fact. It was a small moment, but it carried weight. The cello had become more than reclaimed property. It had become visible proof that Lucy's future was not negotiable. My grandmother continued to move quietly behind the scenes. She updated paperwork, consolidated documents, made sure every asset with Lucy's name attached to it was clearly protected. She never announced these steps. She simply informed me when something was complete. It's done, she would say. Not dramatic. Done. One evening, as we sat together in the living room, Lucy practicing in the background, I asked her something I'd been circling for weeks. Did you always expect this to happen? I said. She didn't look at me immediately. She watched Lucy's bow arm, assessing posture. I expected temptation, she replied. That's not the same as expecting betrayal. And of course breaded an L. No, she agreed softly, but it requires the same preparation. She explained then, more fully than before, why she had created the trust when Lucy first showed serious promise with the instrument. It wasn't just about money. It was about safeguarding potential. Talent draws attention, she said, and attention draws entitlement. I thought about how easily my father had framed the cello as dormant value, how quickly Rachel had dismissed Lucy's attachment as childish. They didn't think she'd notice, I murmured. They didn't think it mattered, my grandmother corrected gently. That distinction still stings. Lucy's audition day arrived in early spring. The regional youth orchestra was competitive, and the hall was filled with teenagers carrying instruments almost as tall as they were. Lucy's fingers trembled slightly as she tuned. Remember, my grandmother whispered, adjusting Lucy's shoulder with practiced precision. Your left hand doesn't need to shout. Lucy smiled faintly. That old phrase. When she stepped into the audition room, she didn't look back at me. She didn't need to. I waited in the hallway, heart pounding in a way that felt disproportionate to the moment. But it wasn't just about music, it was about recovery, about proof that interruption hadn't derailed trajectory. When she emerged, she didn't beam. She didn't frown. She simply nodded once. I played the hard part clean, she said. A week later, the acceptance email arrived. Lucy read it twice before speaking. I got in, she said quietly. No screaming, no jumping, just certainty. That night, she practiced longer than usual, the music filling the house fully and unapologetically. My grandmother sat in her usual chair, eyes closed, absorbing each note like a ledger balancing itself. In the months that followed, the story of the pool faded into background noise, for everyone except us. For neighbors, it became gossip. For extended relatives, it became a cautionary tale they referenced in hushed tones. For my parents, it became something they preferred not to discuss. But for Lucy, It became origin. The point in her memory where she understood that adults can be wrong and that some adults will correct that wrong decisively. I noticed subtle shifts in her confidence. She raised her hand more in class. She corrected peers politely when they misquoted her. She stopped shrinking when someone interrupted. One evening, after a rehearsal, she said something that startled me. "I think I would have stopped playing if we hadn't gotten it back." The honesty of that admission took my breath for a moment. "Why?" I asked. She shrugged slightly. "It would have felt like it wasn't really mine. Ownership. Not just legal. Emotional. That's what had been restored. Looking back now, the pool still exists. Concrete doesn't evaporate when truth intervenes. My parents still drive past it every day in that rental across town, a reminder of what impulsive entitlement cost them. But the narrative shifted permanently. Lucy's place in the family is no longer assumed to be smaller. My grandmother's authority is no longer taken lightly. And I am no longer the daughter who swallows discomfort to maintain peace. Peace built on silence isn't peace. It's erosion. What happened wasn't explosive. It was corrective. And every time Lucy lifts that bow, every time the sound carries confidently through the house without apology, I am reminded that restoration is sometimes quieter than revenge but infinitely more powerful. Yes, it was worth it. 6 weeks. That's how long nothing appeared to happen. If you had looked at our lives from the outside during that stretch, you would have assumed the story was over. The cello was gone. The pool was being built. My parents were posting filtered photos of progress like they had personally engineered summer. But silence is deceptive. Silence is where consequences gather. Lucy practiced every afternoon on the rental instrument her teacher helped us find. It was better than the emergency student cello, but it still felt like wearing someone else's shoes, functional, not fitted. The notes came out clean enough, but they didn't bloom. They didn't resonate the way they had before. She adjusted. That's what Lucy does. She straightened her back, corrected her bow angle, pressed her fingers more precisely into the strings. She never complained, never asked if we were going to fight harder. She simply worked with what she had. That quiet determination scared me more than anger would have. At night, I would stand in the hallway and listen. The music was technically accurate, but there was something missing, something that only comes from knowing an instrument belongs to you. Ownership changes sound. Meanwhile, my parents' backyard became a spectacle. Rachel documented every phase like it was a lifestyle transformation. Fresh concrete poured, stone laid in geometric patterns. Delivery trucks bringing patio furniture. Inflatable flamingos posed in half-filled water. "Making memories," one caption read. "Worth every penny," another declared. Every penny. I screenshotted everything. Not because I wanted to humiliate them later. Because timelines matter. Dates matter. Documentation matters. My grandmother understood that instinctively. When I visited her during those weeks, she didn't ask how I felt first. She asked what had changed. "Has the construction advanced?" She would say calmly. "Yes." "Have they mentioned the sale again?" "No." "Good. Good." That word unsettled me at first. But I began to understand. The quieter they were, the more confident they felt. And confidence without caution leaves fingerprints. Lucy never mentioned the pool directly, but she saw the posts. Kids always do. One evening she paused mid-practice and said, without looking at me, "It looks fun." Anandergotis. The way she said it flat, observational, made my chest tighten. "Do you want to swim?" I asked. She shrugged slightly. "Not really." It wasn't jealousy. It was distance. She was recalibrating her relationship to that space. Weeks passed like that. Quiet adjustments, subtle shifts. My parents continued their renovation narrative, inviting extended family over to see the progress. I declined every invitation, not dramatically, just briefly. Busy. They stopped asking after a while. Then the message appeared in the family group chat one Thursday afternoon. "BBQ next Saturday, 2 p.m. Pool reveal. Bring a side." No emojis this time. Just logistics. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. Lucy glanced over my shoulder. "Are we going?" she asked. Her tone wasn't hopeful. It was careful. I opened my mouth, but I didn't have an answer. That night, my grandmother called before I could decide. "We're going," she said. There was no question in her voice. "Grandma, I don't want Lucy watching you swallow this," she said gently. "She needs to see how boundaries work." I leaned back in my chair. "Is it ready?" "It's in motion," she replied. The phrase again. "What does that mean?" "It means patience was necessary," she said, "but patience has limits." I didn't press further. Saturday arrived with oppressive heat, the kind that makes pavement shimmer. Lucy wore her swimsuit under her sundress again, not because she was excited, because she's 11, and hope doesn't evaporate completely even after betrayal. The drive over was quiet. As we turned onto my parents' street, I saw the cars first, lining both sides. People my mother liked to impress. Neighbors who had watched the excavation begin. Relatives who valued spectacle. The gate to the backyard stood open. Music drifted outward. The pool gleamed. It was finished. Blue water, immaculate stone deck, a pergola strung with lights like they had curated summer itself. Ben was already cannonballing into the deep end. Olivia floated with oversized sunglasses perched dramatically on her nose. Rachel held a drink and laughed loudly at something an aunt said, her voice carrying above the music. My mother stood near the grill, posture tall and triumphant. My father hovered beside her, smiling like a man who believed this moment justified everything. Lucy slowed her steps when she saw it all. She didn't gasp, didn't frown. She just looked. That look will stay with me forever. Not envy, not anger, calculation. I placed my hand on her shoulder. She leaned into it slightly. My mother spotted us and forced brightness into her expression. "Emily, Lucy, you made it." Rachel's eyes flickered briefly, surprised but not thrilled. My father nodded, almost cautiously. Lucy stepped forward, towel folded carefully over her arm. "Hi," she said politely. Ben splashed water toward the edge of the pool, not noticing anything beyond his own joy. For a moment, everything felt suspended. The music, the laughter, the illusion. I could feel something under the surface, though. A tension threaded through my parents' posture. They knew we had come. They didn't know why. "Where's Margaret?" someone asked casually from near the drinks table. My mother's smile tightened. "She's busy," she said quickly. The gate clicked. The sound was small, almost unremarkable, but it sliced through the noise like a blade. Everyone turned. And in that instant, before my grandmother even spoke, I saw it. My parents' faces lost color, because silence had been gathering for 6 weeks, and now it had arrived. The gate didn't slam. It clicked. Such a small, ordinary sound, metal touching metal, a hinge shifting. But that click changed the temperature of the entire backyard. Conversations thinned. Someone lowered their drink mid-sentence. Even the music from the outdoor speaker seemed suddenly too loud, like it didn't understand it had overstayed its welcome. My grandmother walked in as if she had every right to be there. Because she did. She wasn't dressed for confrontation. No dramatic colors. No heavy jewelry. Just a crisp blouse, tailored slacks, sensible shoes. Her posture was straight, her expression neutral, not angry, not smiling. Beside her walked Andrew, carrying a slim folder tucked neatly under his arm. My father's jaw tightened first. My mother's smile flickered, then stiffened into something brittle. Rachel stopped mid-laugh. Lucy straightened beside me in a way that felt instinctive, like her body recognized safety before her mind caught up. "Well," my grandmother said lightly, her gaze sweeping across the blue water, the fresh stone, the string lights. "You've been busy." There was no sarcasm in her tone. That made it worse. My mother stepped forward, forcing warmth into her voice. "Mom, this is a party." "I know," my grandmother replied. "That's why I came." The sentence hung there for a second, deceptively simple. Guests shifted their weight. Someone coughed. A paper plate crinkled. My father cleared his throat. "We can talk inside." "You've had weeks to talk inside," my grandmother said calmly. Rachel's eyes darted toward the cluster of neighbors. "This doesn't have to be public." My grandmother tilted her head slightly. Neither did the sale. That was the first visible crack. Lucy's fingers tightened around her towel. I felt the old instinct rise in me, the reflex to smooth things over, to suggest we step aside, to contain the discomfort before it spread. That instinct had shaped most of my adult life. But I stayed still, because this wasn't about comfort. It was about clarity. I heard you sold the cello, my grandmother said. Not loudly, not accusingly, just stating a fact. My mother's lips parted, then closed again. We didn't want to upset you. You didn't want consequences, my grandmother corrected. The word consequences seemed to echo louder than any shout could have. My father attempted calm. It was a misunderstanding. It's no coming a noun. A misunderstanding requires confusion, my grandmother replied evenly. You were not confused. Andrew stepped forward slightly, opening the folder with quiet precision. He didn't wave papers around. He didn't clear his throat dramatically. He simply existed with documentation. The instrument was held in trust, my grandmother continued. For Lucy. I am the trustee. Lucy is the beneficiary. It was not yours to sell. There it was. Clear. Structured. Irrefutable. The crowd didn't gasp. They absorbed. What trust? Rachel demanded, her voice rising. The legal kind, my grandmother said. My father's composure began to thin. You never told us. Correct, she replied. I did not. That sentence held layers: protection, foresight, experience. Andrew spoke then, his voice steady and professional. The buyer has been notified that the sale was unauthorized. The transaction is being reversed. Full repayment is required. My mother's face drained. Reversed? In full, Andrew confirmed. Rachel gestured wildly toward the pool. We already used the money. Yes, my grandmother said softly. I can see that. There was something almost clinical in her tone now, like she was examining a specimen. This was for the kids, Rachel insisted, her voice sharp with desperation. Lucy is a child, my grandmother replied. The simplicity of that sentence stripped away every rationalization. Behind us, Ben cannonballed into the water, unaware of the tension. Olivia laughed. The sound felt oddly disconnected, like it belonged to a different story. Lucy leaned slightly closer to me. Is it really coming back? She whispered. My grandmother heard her. She turned, her expression softening instantly. It is safe, she said, and it will be returned to you. Lucy exhaled, a small sound that carried 6 weeks of contained fear. My father's voice grew tight. Let's discuss this privately. No, my grandmother said. The word was not loud. It was final. This house, she continued calmly, is also held in trust. Another shift. My mother blinked. What are you saying? Andrew handed them a separate document. Notice to vacate, he explained. 60 days. Rachel let out a short, incredulous laugh. You're kicking us out over a misunderstanding? It is not over the misunderstanding, my grandmother said. It is over the action. It is no day. My father looked suddenly older, the confidence that had fueled this entire project dissolving under the weight of paperwork. You can't do this, my mother said quietly. I can, my grandmother replied. No triumph, no bitterness. Just fact. The backyard began to unravel around us. Conversations restarted in hushed tones. Guests gathered belongings. Someone turned off the music. The pool remained bright and blue, shimmering under the sun, as if it had no idea it had become evidence. I realized then that my grandmother hadn't come for revenge. She had come for correction, for Lucy to witness a boundary drawn cleanly. Rachel muttered something under her breath, something about overreaction, about embarrassment. But no one rallied behind her. Because deep down, even they understood the math. $87,000. An instrument documented, insured, protected. A sale executed without authority. Consequences. Lucy stepped forward slightly, her voice steady but small. I thought I did something wrong. That sentence cut through everything. My grandmother bent slightly to meet her eyes. You did nothing wrong, she said firmly. Something was taken from you. That is not the same. Lucy nodded slowly. And in that moment, I saw something settle into her posture, not relief exactly, but reclamation. The party didn't end with shouting. It ended with quiet dispersal. My parents stood near the grill, motionless, papers in hand. Rachel's anger had turned inward, defensive rather than explosive. The neighbors avoided eye contact. As we turned to leave, my grandmother's hand brushed mine briefly. "I didn't want her to learn the wrong lesson," she murmured. "She didn't," I replied. The gate clicked again as we stepped out. This time, it sounded like punctuation. Behind us, the water still shimmered. But something invisible had shifted permanently. The illusion that Lucy's place in this family was conditional had dissolved. And what replaced it was something far more powerful than anger. It was proof. Proof that boundaries exist. Proof that silence isn't mandatory. Proof that when something is taken from a child, the adults who matter will not whisper about it. They will correct it. And they will do so without raising their voices. After the gate clicked shut behind us that afternoon, I expected my hands to shake. They didn't. They felt steady on the steering wheel as Lucy and I drove home. The heat pressed against the windshield, and the world outside looked exactly the same as it had that morning. Same sidewalks, same trees, same sky, but something fundamental had shifted. Lucy stared out the window for a long time before she spoke. "She wasn't mad," she said quietly. "No," I replied. "She was just sure." Identifier. That word sat between us. Sure. Children recognize certainty when they see it. Not loudness, not drama. Certainty. "That's what boundaries look like," I said gently. Lucy nodded, absorbing it. When we pulled into the driveway of the house that was now legally secured for us, she didn't rush inside. She walked with purpose, cello case steady in her grip. There was no hesitation in her step anymore. Inside, the air felt different, lighter, clearer. My grandmother followed us in a few minutes later, moving with the same composed energy she had carried through the backyard. She didn't mention the pool. She didn't mention the expressions on my parents' faces. She simply walked into the music room, adjusted the humidifier slightly, and checked the cabinet lock. Habit, preparation, stability. Lucy opened the case and drew the bow across the strings again. The sound filled the house fully this time, uncontained. It traveled down the hallway, into the kitchen, up the stairs. No one told her to use her inside voice. No one sighed at repetition. My grandmother sat in the living room, eyes closed, listening. I watched Lucy's posture as she played. Her shoulders no longer curled inward, her chin lifted naturally. The instrument fit her again, not just physically, but emotionally. Ownership had been restored. Later that evening, when Lucy went to shower, I sat across from my grandmother at the kitchen table. "You didn't hesitate," I said. She folded her hands calmly. "Hesitation teaches the wrong lesson, which is that it's negotiable." Her eyes met mine, steady and direct. "Children watch what we tolerate," she added. I thought about the years I had tolerated small dismissals, minor slights, subtle hierarchies in that house. I had called it peacekeeping. I had called it maturity. Lucy would have called it shrinking. My phone buzzed on the table. A text from my mother. "We need to talk." No apology. No acknowledgement. Just logistics. I didn't respond. For once, I didn't feel compelled to smooth it over. Over the next few days, word traveled quietly through extended family. An aunt called me, concerned. A cousin sent a vague message about family unity. Someone else hinted that things could have been handled more discreetly. Discreetly, as if silence would have been more respectful than correction. I answered politely but firmly. "It was handled legally," I said. "And appropriately." The narrative tried to shift, as narratives do. It became less about a stolen instrument and more about communication breakdown, less about unauthorized sale and more about misunderstandings. But paper doesn't misunderstand. Documentation doesn't reinterpret itself. Andrew finalized the repayment agreement within 2 weeks. My parents would return the full amount in installments. The buyer would receive his money back. The transaction would be voided properly. Concrete remains, money moves. Consequences remain longer. Rachel called once, her tone brittle. "You embarrassed us. You sold a child's inheritance," I replied. "It wasn't like that." "It was exactly like that." Silence on the line. Then softer, almost pleading. You could have handled it privately. They had weeks, I said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Lucy's orchestra rehearsals began that month. The first evening we drove to the hall, she sat upright in the passenger seat, fingers flexing slightly as if warming up in her mind. You nervous? I asked. A little, she admitted. But good nervous. When she stepped into the rehearsal room, she wasn't the smallest presence anymore. She blended into the group not because she shrank but because she belonged. Watching her sit among other young musicians, I realized something profound. The cello had not just been returned, her trajectory had. If that instrument had stayed gone, if we had accepted the loss quietly, Lucy's confidence would have eroded in ways that music alone couldn't fix. She might have kept playing, but with hesitation, with doubt. Instead, she carried proof. Proof that when something unfair happens, it can be corrected. Proof that adults can admit wrongdoing even if reluctantly. Proof that her place isn't conditional. Back at home, the house settled into a new rhythm. My grandmother resumed her routine fully, not as a guest, but as an anchor. She organized the pantry the way she liked it. She rearranged furniture slightly to improve acoustics in the living room. The sound travels better this way, she said once, shifting a chair by an inch. Every adjustment was deliberate. Boundaries are like that too. Subtle shifts that change the entire structure. The final day my parents' 60-day notice expired came without spectacle. No dramatic goodbye. No apology tour. A moving truck arrived quietly at dawn. By afternoon, the house they had treated as permanent was empty of their belongings. Lucy stood by the upstairs window, watching from a distance. Are they mad? She asked. Probably, I answered honestly. Are you? I considered that. I was, I said. Now I'm clear. End quote. Clarity feels different from anger. It doesn't burn, it steadies. When the truck pulled away for the last time, Lucy didn't cheer. She didn't wave. She simply turned away from the window and went to practice. The sound that filled the house that evening wasn't triumphant. It wasn't defiant. It was confident, measured, certain. And as I sat on the couch listening, I realized the true shift hadn't happened at the pool party. It had happened in Lucy's understanding. She no longer believed she had to shrink to keep peace. She no longer believed her place was negotiable. And that lesson, quiet, steady, irreversible, was worth every uncomfortable moment. The pool still glimmers across town. Concrete doesn't dissolve because truth shows up. But in this house, when Lucy plays, the sound carries without apology. And that is what remains. The strangest part of everything wasn't the confrontation. It wasn't even the legal paperwork. It was what happened afterward when life kept moving, but the roles in our family had quietly shifted. A few weeks after the pool party, we attended a larger family gathering for the first time. It wasn't hosted at my parents' new rental. It was at my aunt's house. Neutral territory. The kind of place where tension can pretend to behave. I almost didn't go. But Lucy wanted to. I don't want it to be weird forever, she said, shrugging as she packed her music into her bag. It's just family. Just family. That phrase used to mean something uncomplicated to me. Now it carried layers. When we arrived, conversations paused for half a beat before resuming. Not dramatically, just subtly. The kind of micro-shift you only notice when you're watching for it. My mother stood near the kitchen island, holding a plate of appetizers she hadn't touched. She looked thinner, tired in a way that wasn't physical. Rachel hovered close to her, her usual bold energy muted. Lucy walked in with her cello case, because she had rehearsal later and didn't want to go home first. She didn't ask permission to bring it inside. She didn't apologize for taking up space. She set it carefully against the wall and joined her cousins near the snack table. No one commented. That was the first difference. No one made a joke about guarding the valuable instrument. No one rolled their eyes. Silence can be respect when it's chosen. My grandmother arrived a few minutes later, greeted warmly but cautiously. The air adjusted around her the way it does around someone whose authority is no longer theoretical. She wasn't treated like the fragile elder anymore. She was treated like the decision-maker. That shift didn't come from intimidation. It came from proof. During dinner, my uncle tried to make light of everything. Well, he chuckled awkwardly. I guess we all learned something about paperwork. The laugh that followed was thin. My grandmother set her fork down calmly. Documentation exists so that no one has to argue about memory, she said. It wasn't harsh. It was instructive. My father stared at his plate. He hadn't spoken much since we arrived. The confidence that used to define him had been replaced by something quieter, caution, maybe. I caught his eye briefly. There was something there I hadn't seen before. Not anger. Awareness. After dinner, Lucy excused herself to practice in the den before rehearsal. I followed quietly, standing just outside the doorway. The first notes filled the room gently. Not loud, not performative, just steady. A few relatives drifted closer to listen. No one interrupted. No one told her to lower the volume. They just listened. It was a small audience, but it felt different from any she had experienced in that house before. There was no hierarchy in the room, no subtle ranking of whose talents mattered more. When she finished, there was soft applause. Not exaggerated. Not patronizing. Genuine. Lucy smiled, not widely, not dramatically, but confidently. Later that evening, as we prepared to leave for rehearsal, my mother approached me near the front door. I didn't think it would go that far, she said quietly. That's the thing about actions, I replied. They do. She looked at Lucy across the room, adjusting her bow. She seems different, my mother murmured. She is, I said. My mother hesitated, then added, I never meant for her to feel less. Intent and impact are rarely the same. I know, I said. But she did. There was no argument left in her. Just acceptance. Rachel joined us briefly, her usual sharpness replaced with something measured. We're figuring things out, she said. The repayment plan is manageable. It was the closest thing to acknowledgement I had heard. I'm glad, I replied, because here's the truth no one says out loud. I didn't want them destroyed. I wanted them accountable. There's a difference. On the drive to rehearsal, Lucy was quiet. Are you okay? I asked. Yeah, she said after a moment. It wasn't weird. That word mattered. Weird is what children fear most in family dynamics. Awkwardness they can't name. Tension they can't decode. It won't be weird forever, I told her. She nodded. Great-grandma didn't yell, she said thoughtfully. No. She just made it right. Yes, that's what it was. Not revenge. Not humiliation. Correction. Back at the house later that night, after rehearsal, my grandmother and I sat on the back steps while Lucy showered upstairs. The evening air was cooler. The sky stretched wide above us. You handled it exactly how you intended, I said. She folded her hands in her lap. I handled it the only way that teaches, she replied. And what does it teach? That value isn't determined by volume, she said. And that belonging is not conditional. I thought about how easily Lucy could have internalized the wrong message. That her passion was expendable. That her talent was negotiable. That convenience outranked commitment. Instead, she had learned something sturdier. Boundaries exist. Protection exists. Adults can be wrong and other adults can correct them. Inside, Lucy began practicing again, unable to resist running through the new piece she'd been assigned. The notes floated through the open window, confident and clear. My grandmother closed her eyes, listening. Do you regret making it public? I asked quietly. She considered that. No, she said. Private correction would have protected their pride. Public correction protected her. That sentence stayed with me. Because in families like ours, pride often outranks principle. This time, it didn't. When Lucy finished playing, she stepped outside to join us. Ready for bed? I asked. In a minute, she said, sitting between us. She leaned back slightly, comfortable, secure, and I realized then that the story wasn't just about what had been taken or returned. It was about what had shifted permanently. Lucy no longer watched the room to see where she fit. She assumed she did. And that quiet confidence, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself, was the most powerful consequence of all. There's a moment in every family conflict when the truth stops being arguable. Not because someone wins, but because the evidence settles. For us, that moment wasn't actually the pool party. It was what came after, when the repayment schedule began, when the house transfer paperwork finalized, when silence replaced defensiveness. Consequences don't shout. They accumulate. My parents began making installment payments to return the full $87. It wasn't dramatic. There were no public apologies, just monthly withdrawals, quiet recalculations, and the steady awareness that an impulsive decision had turned into a long-term obligation. My father stopped talking about investments. My mother stopped using the phrase family asset. Words have a way of disappearing when they no longer protect you. One afternoon, I ran into my dad at the hardware store. It was accidental, one of those small-town overlaps you can't avoid. He looked surprised to see me, then unsure of what expression to settle on. "How's Lucy?" he asked after a pause. "She's good," I said. "She made the youth orchestra." He nodded slowly. "That's impressive." It wasn't effusive praise. It wasn't dismissal either. It was acknowledgement. We stood in the aisle for a moment longer than necessary. "I didn't think it through," he said finally. That was the closest I would ever get to an apology. "No," I agreed gently. "You didn't." He didn't defend himself. Didn't blame my grandmother. Didn't mention the trust. He just nodded once and pushed his card away. Awareness doesn't undo damage, but it prevents repetition. At home, Lucy's rehearsals intensified. The youth orchestra required discipline. Late evenings. Long passages repeated until muscle memory took over. The first time she performed publicly with them, I sat in the auditorium beside my grandmother, hands clasped tightly in my lap. The stage lights washed over the musicians, casting soft shadows behind their music stands. Lucy sat near the front of her section, posture straight, bow poised. When the conductor lifted his hands, silence fell. And then the music began. It was layered, complex, alive. Lucy's part wove seamlessly through the arrangement. She wasn't the loudest. She didn't need to be. She was steady, integrated, essential. Halfway through the performance, I glanced at my grandmother. She wasn't watching the conductor. She was watching Lucy. Not anxiously, proudly. After the concert, Lucy met us in the lobby, cheeks flushed from adrenaline. "You didn't miss the hard part, right?" she asked. "We didn't miss anything," I told her. My grandmother placed a hand lightly on Lucy's shoulder. "You belong there," she said. Lucy smiled in a way that wasn't shy or uncertain. It was knowing. Later that night, as we drove home, Lucy looked out the window thoughtfully. "I'm glad we didn't just let it go," she said. "Me too," I replied. "I think if we had, I would have felt small." That word again. Small. For years, Lucy had absorbed subtle signals about volume and space. Who could be loud? Who needed to be quiet? Who got celebrated for being spirited? And who was praised for being so well behaved? The cello incident had exposed that dynamic clearly, and then corrected it. My grandmother's choice to make the confrontation public had been deliberate. I understood that more fully now. Private correction protects comfort. Public correction rebalances hierarchy. A few weeks later, my mother invited Lucy and me to dinner at their rental. It wasn't lavish. No backyard, no shimmering water. Just a modest dining table and the smell of something simmering on the stove. Lucy brought her cello again. Not as a statement. As routine. My mother watched her set the case down near the wall. "You can practice here if you want," she offered softly. Lucy looked at me, then back at her grandmother's old music stand my mother had borrowed temporarily. "Okay," Lucy said. She played for 20 minutes after dinner, not a performance, just scales and a section she was refining. No one interrupted. No one asked her to lower her volume. Ben and Olivia sat on the couch quietly, listening. It wasn't dramatic. It was normal, and that felt monumental. After Lucy finished, my mother approached her hesitantly. "You're really good," she said. Lucy nodded once. "I work at it." There was no apology attached to the statement. No self-deprecation. Just fact. On the drive home, Lucy was quiet again. But this time, it wasn't the heavy silence from weeks before. It was reflective. "Do you think they understand now?" she asked. "I think they understand consequences," I said carefully. She considered that. "That's enough," she decided. And maybe she was right. Understanding doesn't require emotional transformation. Sometimes it just requires a boundary that doesn't move. The house we now lived in felt different in small, daily ways. My grandmother's presence anchored it. The music room was fully restored, not just physically, but symbolically. The cabinet lock clicked closed every night. The humidifier hummed steadily. Preparation, clarity, security. One evening, as Lucy practiced a particularly challenging piece, she stopped mid-measure and looked up at me. "Do you think I'll always have to prove it?" she asked. "Prove what?" "That I deserve it." I walked into the room and sat beside her. "You don't have to prove you deserve something that's already yours," I said. She studied my face for a moment, then nodded. And I realized that was the final layer of this story. The cello had been recovered. The house had been protected. The money was being repaid. But the real restoration was internal. Lucy no longer equated belonging with compliance. She no longer believed silence was required for acceptance. She had watched adults draw a boundary and enforce it calmly. That lesson would follow her longer than any instrument ever could. Families don't change overnight. Dynamics don't dissolve instantly. But hierarchy can shift. And once it does, it rarely returns to its original shape. My parents still carry the financial reminder of their decision. Rachel still edits her narratives when convenient. But when Lucy walks into a room now, with her cello case steady at her side, she doesn't scan for permission. She assumes her place. And that quiet certainty is something no one in our family will ever attempt to sell again. If you had told me a year ago that a single instrument could rearrange the entire structure of my family, I would have laughed. Now I understand it was never just about the cello. It was about who we believed was allowed to matter. The final repayment cleared late that summer. Andrew called my grandmother personally to confirm the balance had been settled in full. There was no ceremony attached to it. No dramatic announcement, just the quiet conclusion of a financial obligation that had stretched longer than my parents expected. "Done," my grandmother said when she hung up the phone. She didn't smile widely. She didn't sigh. Just done. I watched her for a moment. "Do you feel better?" She considered the question. "I feel finished," she replied. That word struck me differently. Finished implies completion, not victory. Closure, not conquest. The house had settled into its new rhythm by then. Lucy's rehearsals were steady, her schedule busier than ever. My grandmother resumed small rituals that once felt ordinary but now felt intentional. Fresh flowers on the dining table, afternoon tea in the music room, paperwork reviewed at the same hour every week. Security wasn't assumed anymore. It was maintained. One afternoon, Lucy came home from rehearsal unusually quiet. She placed her cello in its stand and sat on the edge of the couch without speaking. "Bad practice?" I asked gently. "No," she said. "It was good." She hesitated. "Then what?" She looked up at me, thoughtful. "I realized something," she said. "If they hadn't tried to take it, I wouldn't know how much it mattered." The maturity in that sentence startled me. "Do you wish it hadn't happened?" I asked. She tilted her head slightly, considering. "I wish it hadn't hurt," she said honestly. "But I'm glad I know now." "Know what?" "That I don't have to be quiet to keep things calm." There it was. The core lesson. For years, Lucy had equated quiet with safety, compliance with acceptance. But what she witnessed at that pool party, and everything that followed, had rewritten that equation. My parents still struggled occasionally with the shift in dynamics. My mother tried harder now, though awkwardly. She asked Lucy about her music more often. She attended one orchestra performance and clapped longer than anyone else in her row. My father remained more reserved. But there was a new carefulness in him. He no longer made offhand comments about value or practicality when Lucy mentioned competitions or instrument maintenance. He had learned that paperwork does not bend to confidence. One evening, he surprised me by calling directly. "I want to contribute to her next competition fee," he said. The offer caught me off guard. "You don't have to," I replied. "I know," he said quietly. "I want to." It wasn't redemption, but it was responsibility. I accepted. Because this story was never about exile. It was about correction. Rachel adjusted too, though differently. She never openly admitted fault, but she stopped making comparative jokes. She stopped referencing expensive hobbies in passing. Instead, she focused on her own children's activities, balanced attention more deliberately. Whether it came from guilt or growth didn't matter as much as the outcome. Lucy noticed the changes, even if she didn't comment on them. One Saturday afternoon, she practiced with the windows open. The sound carried into the yard, steady and confident. A neighbor paused on the sidewalk to listen. A small audience gathered casually. Lucy didn't shrink. She played through the entire piece without glancing outside to see who was watching. Afterward, my grandmother joined her in the garden. "You play differently now," she observed. "How?" Lucy asked. "Like you're not asking permission." Lucy smiled slightly. "I'm not," she said. I stood at the kitchen window, watching them. That was the moment I understood fully. The instrument had been returned, yes. The money had been repaid. The legal structures had been reinforced. But the real restitution was psychological. Lucy no longer scanned the room before speaking. She didn't preface opinions with apologies. She didn't automatically yield space to louder personalities. At her next school presentation, her teacher emailed me afterward. "She's remarkably confident," the teacher wrote. "It's been wonderful to watch her growth." Growth. The word felt earned, not accidental. My grandmother's foresight had created more than a trust. It had created a framework, one that ensured Lucy's potential would not be subject to convenience or hierarchy. One evening, as we sat in the living room after rehearsal, Lucy looked at me thoughtfully. "Do you think they'll ever try something like that again?" she asked. "No," I said firmly. "How do you know?" "Because now they know the boundary," I replied. "And they know it won't move." She nodded, satisfied. Boundaries only work when they are enforced consistently. My grandmother understood that instinctively. Later that night, after Lucy went to bed, I sat with my grandmother at the dining table. "You changed everything," I told her. She shook her head gently. "No," she said. "I clarified everything." Clarified. That word again. Before the cello was sold, our family operated on unspoken hierarchies. Rachel's needs floated higher. My parents' convenience carried weight. Lucy's quietness made her easy to overlook. Afterward, those hierarchies were exposed and corrected. Not through shouting, through documentation, through calm, through consequence. The pool still exists, shimmering across town. But it no longer represents triumph. It represents a lesson. When I drive past occasionally, I don't feel anger. I feel perspective. Because what remains here in this house, in Lucy's posture, in the steady hum of the music room, is stronger than concrete. It's certainty. Lucy's audition season continued into fall. She took on more challenging repertoire, pieces that demanded stamina and precision. She didn't doubt her place in the orchestra. She didn't question whether she deserved the instrument in her hands. She simply played. And every time she lifted the bow, I was reminded that the true value of that $87,000 was never monetary. It was structural. It reinforced a boundary. It shifted a hierarchy. It taught a child that her passion is not expendable. And in the quiet aftermath, after the paperwork, after the repayments, after the awkward dinners, what remained wasn't division. It was alignment. Not perfect, but clear. And clarity, I've learned, is stronger than comfort. The cello rests in its stand each night, cabinet locked, humidifier humming steadily. Not because we fear loss, but because we understand value. And value, once defended properly, does not need to shout. It simply remains. There's a misconception about justice that I used to believe. I thought it ended things. I thought once consequences were delivered, once repayment was made, once apologies spoken or implied floated into the air, the story would close neatly. But justice doesn't end a story. It rewrites the roles inside it. By the time the final repayment cleared and the legal dust settled completely, our family gatherings had become something new. Not warmer, necessarily, not magically healed, but balanced. Balance is quieter than reconciliation. It doesn't require hugging it out or pretending nothing happened. It simply removes the uneven weight that was tilting the room. Lucy's orchestra season moved into its busiest stretch that fall. Longer rehearsals, harder repertoire, regional travel for performances. She carried her cello with the ease of someone who knows it belongs to her, not tentatively, not protectively, just naturally. One afternoon before a competition, I found her in the music room polishing the instrument carefully. "You nervous?" I asked. "A little," she admitted. "But I like that feeling." "That's growth," I said. She looked up at me thoughtfully. "I used to think I had to be the easiest one," she said. "You know, the least trouble." I swallowed slightly. "I know." She smiled faintly. "I don't think that anymore." That was the quiet victory. Not that my parents paid the money back. Not that they moved out. But that Lucy stopped equating worth with compliance. My mother tried in her own way to recalibrate. She asked more questions, now specific ones. Not, "How's music?" but "What piece are you working on?" Not, "Are you practicing?" but "What's the hardest section?" Specificity is respect. She attended another performance and brought flowers, not extravagant, just thoughtful. She didn't attempt to claim credit. She didn't make it about family pride. She simply clapped. My father remained more reserved, but something in him had shifted permanently. He stopped talking about practical decisions in front of Lucy. He no longer framed hobbies in terms of return on investment. He had learned that not everything valuable converts to dollars. One evening, he surprised Lucy by asking if she would play something for him specifically. Not for a room, not for show. "For me," he said quietly. Lucy hesitated only a second before nodding. She played a slow, intricate piece, her bow moving steadily across the strings. When she finished, there was no applause, just silence. Then, my father cleared his throat. "That's extraordinary," he said. It wasn't effusive, but it was sincere. Rachel adjusted too, though more subtly. She stopped comparing her children's activities to Lucy's. No more jokes about expensive tastes. No more eye rolls about rehearsal schedules. Instead, she redirected attention toward balance, making sure Ben and Olivia were encouraged in their own interests without diminishing Lucy's. Was it perfect? No. But it was aware. Awareness is a powerful correction. One afternoon, months after everything unfolded, Lucy and I drove past my parents' old neighborhood. The pool shimmered in the distance, visible above the fence line. Lucy glanced at it briefly, then looked away. "Do you hate it?" I asked gently. She considered the question. "No," she said finally. "It just reminds me." "Of what?" "That I don't have to disappear." That sentence felt heavier than any legal document ever could. The cello had become more than reclaimed property. It had become a marker, a before and after. Before, Lucy watched the room carefully. After, she walked into it assuming she belonged. Before, I smoothed tension instinctively. After, I allowed discomfort to clarify boundaries. Before, my grandmother was underestimated. After, she was respected in ways no one would challenge again. One evening, as autumn settled in and the air turned crisp, Lucy practiced late into the night. The house was quiet except for the steady hum of the humidifier and the layered sound of her music filling each room. My grandmother and I sat in the living room, listening. "You never doubted?" I asked softly. "Doubted what?" she replied. "That it would turn out this way." "Edis." She folded her hands in her lap. "I didn't doubt the paperwork," she said. "I trusted it." "And Lucy?" She smiled faintly. "I trusted her more. Trust, I've learned, is different from hope. Hope wishes. Trust prepares. My grandmother had prepared long before anyone realized it was necessary. That foresight didn't just recover an instrument, it reshaped a family's power structure. When Lucy finished practicing, she stepped into the living room, cheeks slightly flushed. "Ready for bed?" I asked. "In a minute," she said, sitting cross-legged on the floor between us. She leaned back comfortably, not scanning for cues, not adjusting her posture to fit the room. Just existing. That ease is what stays with me. The pool remains across town, a permanent structure built from a temporary decision. My parents still carry the financial reminder of that mistake. Rachel still edits narratives occasionally when it suits her. But none of them attempt to touch Lucy's future now, because boundaries, once enforced calmly and publicly, become understood. And understanding, even reluctant, reshapes behavior. Sometimes I'm asked if my grandmother went too far, if eviction was excessive, if public correction was necessary. I think about Lucy standing in that music room months earlier, staring at an empty corner, asking if she had done something wrong. And I think about her now standing on a stage under bright lights, bow poised confidently, no longer apologizing for the sound she makes. No, it wasn't too far. It was far enough. Justice didn't fracture our family. It clarified it. It showed each of us exactly where we stood and where we would not stand again. And every time Lucy lifts her cello from its stand, cabinet secured, humidifier humming steadily in the background, I'm reminded of the simplest truth this entire experience taught us. Value is not negotiable. Belonging is not conditional. And silence is not the price of peace. If there's one thing this story taught me, it's that justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it stands calmly in the middle of a backyard and redraws the lines no one thought would move. This wasn't just about an $87,000 cello. It was about hierarchy, about who gets prioritized, and about what happens when convenience outweighs character. It was about a child learning that her passion is not negotiable and that belonging should never require shrinking. What made this story powerful wasn't revenge. It was correction. It was documentation over drama, clarity over chaos, and most of all, it was a grandmother who understood that protecting a child's future sometimes means letting adults feel uncomfortable. If you've ever felt like the quiet one in the room, if you've ever been asked to stay small to keep the peace, I hope this story reminds you that boundaries are not cruelty. They are protection. Thank you for listening all the way through. If stories about justice, family dynamics, and quiet strength resonate with you, subscribe to Revenge Truth Vault. There are many more stories waiting to be told, and sometimes hearing them is how we learn to stand a little taller ourselves.